A cold wind tears at the flags at the gates of Golden Spire Academy when Ethan deliberately catches his toe on a stone and almost falls, catching the lazy smirks of the students on himself, as if he himself is exposing his neck to their contempt, while his fingers in his pocket painfully squeeze the copper shard with his father's formula. He answers the examiner's question with a deliberately incorrect string of runes, slowly, almost defiantly, as if he can't even discern the basics, and hears the dry scratch of a pen registering the gap, and a stubborn wave rises beneath his ribs, which he suppresses before it gives him away with his voice. When the list of those admitted is pinned to the wall, his name hangs at the very bottom next to the mark 0 student, and someone's finger immediately pokes at the line with a chuckle, but Ethan only bows his head, as if he didn't understand the insult, although his gaze manages to catch the archive stamp in the corner of the sheet. In the classroom, he chooses the far row, deliberately hits his neighbor's inkwell with his elbow and stains the table with a dark stain, apologizing too loudly and awkwardly, while the professor winces and files him away as a problem, and Ethan counts the steps to the hidden door behind the lectern out of the corner of his eye. During the first training session, he places his feet too wide and activates his stance too late, catching the irritated look of Karen, who moves cleanly and rigidly, like a taut string, and throws a short, watch and repeat, over his shoulder. Ethan repeats with a barely perceptible delay, deliberately breaking the rhythm, and falls to one knee as if he has lost his balance, though at the same moment his fingers catch the vibration of someone else's spell nearby, and he stealthily shifts the flow to feel the place where the structure is cracking. In the dorm, he chooses a bed near the wall where a crack runs from the floor to the ceiling, and when his neighbors fall asleep, he runs his fingernail along the line, as if reading a map, and then closes his eyes and remembers his father's voice, quiet, almost a whisper, "Don't take it, you'll break the mold." At night, he goes out into the empty training hall, where the light from the lanterns falls in stripes on the stone, and places his palm in the air in front of him, as if holding an invisible surface, and then slowly squeezes his fingers, feeling how the alien mana in space resists, like a living body. He doesn't create a flow, doesn't accumulate power, but waits until a weak training spell in the corner of the room activates on a timer, and at the moment of opening, he abruptly changes the angle of his palm, as if breaking a joint, and the light contour twitches, losing shape, crumbling without an explosion. Ethan exhales shortly, sharply, as if suppressing a cough, and takes a step back, watching as the energy doesn't disappear, but flows to the side, filling the void, and for a second his lips tremble, because it works exactly as his father said, without unnecessary noise. The next day, the teacher calls him to the board, and Ethan again leaves a blank space in the basic sequence, this time too precisely to seem accidental. The class giggles quietly, and Karen stares longer than the others, as if for the first time he notices a repeating pattern in these gaps. During dueling practice, Ethan raises his arm a split second too late and takes a blow to the body, falling so hard that the air is knocked from his lungs, but at the moment of contact, his fingers catch the other's flow, and in the pain, he manages to recognize the knot on which the entire technique rests. He rolls to the side and remains lying there longer than necessary, while the teacher dryly records the defeat, and the exact point of the break is already imprinted in his head, and this knowledge burns more than humiliation and the pain in his back. After class, Karen comes up close, stops at arm's length, and, without hiding his contempt, quietly says, "You're a disgrace to the level," and Ethan just shrugs and lowers his gaze, as if these words didn't get anywhere deeper than the skin. In the dining room, Ethan drops a tray so badly that soup scatters across the stone, the bowl breaks, and the sharp edge cuts his finger, and while he silently picks up the shards in a sticky puddle to growing laughter, the conversations around him finally cement his role as an easy target. At night, he returns to the empty hall and sets 3 training circles before him, activating them one by one. Each time, he waits for them to open, then with a sharp twist of his fingers, he breaks the knot, and 2 of the spells fade cleanly, but the third twitches, not as if it were seriously resisting it for the first time. He tries to repeat it faster, and the energy explodes sideways, ripping stone from the wall with a screech and burning his cheek with sparks. Ethan recoils, barely managing to extinguish the rest, and when silence returns, his hands are visibly shaking. Another half step in the hall would have raised an alarm. In the morning, the first public test is announced, and the hall quickly fills with students, teachers, and senior curators. An ancient artifact with scales, unbroken for 100 years, awaits in the center, which is why 2 control mages are on duty next to it. Ethan comes out last, too slowly even for his role, and the laughter in the audience is already more confident than before, because Karen managed to show an almost unattainable result and now stands to the side, arms crossed, like a man who can only watch someone else fail. Ethan places his palm on the cold metal, hears a low hum inside, like the breathing of a sleeping animal, and closes his eyes for a brief moment, pulling his father's voice from his memory. Don't push with force, find the seam and tear it. It doesn't immediately release the flow, but waits for the artifact to begin reading, and at the very moment of activation, it abruptly changes the pressure angle, as if breaking an invisible frame. The light inside the device stumbles, twitches, and for a second seems to fall into emptiness. The scales don't grow, cracks of light run across them, like glass under internal pressure. Then the body shudders so violently that one of the control mages reflexively retreats, and the next second the artifact goes out entirely, turning into a dead mass that should never have broken under any circumstances. The silence in the room falls like a wall. Someone in the upper rows jumps up to get a better look, one teacher takes a step forward and immediately freezes, and another involuntarily extinguishes his own spell, as if afraid to even touch on what just happened. Ethan jerks his hand away and steps back, his shoulders slumping into his usual confused student pose, but inside he still feels the sense of a broken structure, too clean, too precise, too familiar. Equipment failure, one of the teachers blurts out too quickly and too loudly, almost drowning out the whispers in the hall, and the assistants immediately shield the artifact with their bodies, as if the main thing now is not fixing it, but hiding the fact of the breakdown. Valeria, the director, stands on the balcony, not making a single unnecessary movement. She doesn't frown, doesn't applaud, but simply looks down so intently, as if she's seeing not a result but a forbidden principle, and her fingers slowly tighten on the railing until they leave white marks. After the test, Ethan is called into an office that smells of dust, leather bindings, and something locked away for a long time, and the administrator announces in a dry voice that the result has been annulled due to a device malfunction, pushing the document forward as if a signature is needed before any questions. Ethan nods with exaggerated haste, signs unevenly, as if he really can't hold a pen, but while the sheet is being pulled back, he manages to notice the same archival seal on the table and the edge of a closed folder with a stamp that shouldn't have ended up there by accident. In the hallway, Karen catches up with him, abruptly turns him around by the shoulder and, for the first time, looks at him without mockery, only with a dull tension. "You did something strange," and Ethan blinks slowly and shrugs, as if he doesn't even understand the accusation itself. Karen's fingers tighten on his shoulder, as if he wants to force an answer, but he lets go before he crosses the line, takes a step back and continues to look as if he is trying to piece together a new explanation from the rubble that still doesn't add up. That night, Ethan comes into the hall again, but this time, from the very threshold, he senses a strange presence. Valeria stands in the shadows by the wall, and her stillness weighs more heavily than any gesture, while he raises his hand to the empty space, as if he had agreed to show something that was forbidden to be shown to anyone. He pauses only for a breath, feeling her gaze like a cold blade between his shoulder blades, then continues, slowly, precisely, and breaks the structure of a simple spell so cleanly that the energy flows away without a splash, without noise, as if it had simply been deprived of the right to hold together. Valeria only comes out after this and asks quietly, without surprise, without praise, "Who taught you this?" And there is more danger in her voice than a direct threat. Ethan lowers his hand and gaze, as if searching for words that don't exist or that would be fatal to say out loud. He answers evasively and too briefly, but that's enough for her. Valeria nods barely noticeably, as if she's received exactly the confirmation she came for, and leaves, leaving behind not relief, but a cold feeling that he's now being consciously observed. At the next test, Ethan again loses by all visible indicators, misses punches and ruins his calculations, but now every mistake costs him more. The teachers definitively label him as hopeless, and he scratches out the cracks in other people's techniques within each failure, paying for it with bruises and time. When the S-class student unleashes a heavy blow at him, Ethan, as always, raises his hand late, but at the last moment he changes the angle of his palm, and the flow is not simply deflected, it turns back with such a twist, as if someone turned the very logic of the spell inside out. The deflected blow slams into the attacker and knocks him down so hard that a sharp collective gasp runs through the room, but Ethan immediately falls to one knee as if he himself had barely survived the defense, leaving everyone with the comfortable version of chance before they dare call it anything else. The teacher frowns, writing down the incident as the attacker's mistake, and Ethan lowers his head, hiding his gaze, in which for a moment flashes the cold precision of a man who has tested his calculations in a real fight and got exactly the result he expected. In the forbidden zone, he moves more quietly than usual, because here a mistake is no longer worth one's reputation, only one's body. When the first monster emerges from the shadows, Ethan doesn't strike it, but with a quick flick of his fingers, he breaks the direction of its aggression, and the creature, with a roar, lunges not at him, but at its nearest kin. Within seconds, the space explodes with grunts, blows, and the ragged screech of claws, monsters slashing at each other in blind rage, and Ethan navigates between the outbreaks of violence on the edge of contact, not defeating the force directly, but pushing the chaos to work for him, and barely manages to escape when one paw finally tears the fabric at his shoulder. In a team mission, he again takes on the role of ballast, falling behind, making mistakes in formation, causing his comrades to exchange irritated glances, but now it's more dangerous. One miscalculation by the team almost takes them out of the scheme, and Ethan deliberately steps aside, accepting the role of the weak link in order to remain outside the control center. While the team struggles with training patterns and begins to lose momentum, Ethan acts independently, quickly, almost imperceptibly, breaking key nodes of enemy techniques one by one, and the battlefield gradually shifts in their favor, although no one can prove that the turning point began exactly where he happened. Karen watches this from his perch longer and harder, because the familiar picture doesn't make sense. Where Ethan should be interfering, the environment itself somehow starts working after him, and for the first time Karen is left without an explanation he can grasp. Later, he finds Ethan alone, gets too close, and says in a low voice, "You lie about your weakness," and Ethan looks up for just a moment and then looks away, as if this direct blow had hit closer to the truth than any previous one. Chiron clenches his fists so hard that his knuckles turn white, but he makes no move to fight. His anger is empty, because his opponent can neither be measured nor caught in an open superiority, and this is precisely what infuriates him most of all. When they try to frame Ethan, accusing him of violating protocols, he stands before the committee calmly, almost indifferently, and it is this silence that begins to irritate the audience more than any excuses, as if he knows in advance that words will not change anything here. Students, teachers, and supervisors gather around, the air tightens like a string about to break, and Ethan, without waiting for permission, steps forward, raises his hand, and quietly, but so clearly that even whispers are silenced, says, "Watch carefully." He simultaneously activates 3 measuring devices and waits until exactly the moment of full deployment, and then, with one smooth movement, changes the pressure in each one. The light inside twitches, breaks, and the 3 housings go out almost in the same second, as if someone had pulled the very operating principle out of them. Brief wave of fear, not a whisper, ripples through the room. Someone jumps up, one of the junior faculty members steps back, Ethan slowly lowers his hand and looks up at Valeria. Why isn't he in the story? He doesn't say the name, but the pause after the question shatters the room more than any shout. Karen slowly turns his gaze to the director, because for the first time he understands, the problem isn't the strange student, but a hole within the system itself. The silence thickens to a physical pressure. No one moves as Valeria slowly lowers her gaze from the balcony to Ethan, her fingers tightening so tightly on the railing that the white marks become almost chalky. Karen takes a step forward so abruptly, as if the decision had burst out of him before he thought, and stops next to Ethan, not looking at him, but only at the director. "Answer," and for the first time there is no student deference in his voice. Valeria takes her time answering. She begins to descend the stairs, each step echoing through the hall like a blow, until the students silently part, revealing a narrow corridor in which the tension becomes almost unbearable. Stopping in front of Ethan, at arm's length, she looks straight ahead and calmly, as if the person in front of her is no longer a student, but a dangerous phenomenon that was noticed too late, and only her even breathing reveals the price she pays for this immobility. "You know what you're asking," she says quietly, her voice unwavering, yet heavy with the stone of a long-ago decision. Ethan merely bows his head, his eyes never leaving his. He doesn't respond with words, only barely moving his fingers, as if he's ready to tear apart the nearest structure again, and this almost imperceptible gesture is enough to make several teachers tense up at the same time, ready to strike first. Karen turns his head to Ethan, their eyes meeting for a second, and in this clash there is no old hostility, only a harsh, painful search for support at the moment when his entire world begins to sag beneath his feet. Valeria takes a step closer, and her voice grows cold. This is not the place for such demonstrations, and at the edges of the hall, suppressive seals are already beginning to awaken, slowly gathering into the outline of a possible reprisal. Ethan lowers his hand, acknowledging the limit but not retreating an inch. His back remains straight, his shoulders still, and there's more defiance in this stance than in any overt gesture. "Then where is the place?" he says calmly, and the words fall into the silence like heavy stones, spreading in circles around the room, where no one is sure anymore that the rules still apply. One of the senior mages can't take it anymore and raises his hand, forming a containment field around Ethan, but he only tilts his head slightly, and the structure of the spell immediately trembles, as if losing its grip even before the form is completed. Valeria abruptly stops the magician with one movement, "Not now," and, returning her gaze to Ethan, no longer hides in it the shadow of a decision, so heavy that it seems to change the air around her. Karen takes another step forward, stepping completely beyond the line of students, and loudly pronounces, "If the system is right, it will withstand the question," so that several teachers turn to him almost in fear. Murmur of murmurs passes through the room, some backing away as if the question itself is contagious, but Ethan remains motionless, allowing Karen's words to do what no demonstration could ever do: split the shared fear aloud. Valeria closes her eyes for just a moment, like someone weighing not the options, but the price of the inevitable, and when she opens them again, nothing remains of the former observer, only the one who is ready to hold on to the system at any cost. "The exam will proceed as scheduled," she says clearly, cutting off the moment with a single, official blade, and turns before anyone can object, her cloak fluttering sharply behind her, a sign of a decision already made without them. The students begin to make noise, but the sound remains muffled, as if no one dares to speak out loud, and Ethan exhales slowly, slumping his shoulders, and turns towards the exit without looking back. Karen remains where he is, watching the director go, his fingers clenching into fists and then slowly unclenching, as if he is trying to hold on to something that is already slipping through his fingers. Ethan walks slowly down the hallway, his fingers brushing the wall, feeling the faint remnants of spells in the stone, as if reading them like an old text, and finding familiar logic in every scene. He stops at the closed door of the archive, where the seals flicker with a faint light, and holds his hand in the air for a second, without touching it, as if testing a boundary that cannot yet be crossed openly. At night, he returns there, when the corridors are empty and the light from the lanterns falls in narrow strips, and he slowly raises his palm, feeling the protective spells unfold, ready to repel the invasion. He doesn't attack them, but waits until the structure is fully activated, and then makes a short movement, as if breaking an invisible lock, and one of the seals trembles, losing its shape, without making a sound. Ethan steps back, allowing his defense to recover, and repeats the movement again, slower, more precise, as if learning from every touch, his breathing becoming even, like a man settling into a familiar rhythm. At that moment, footsteps appeared at the end of the corridor, even, deliberately unrestrained, and Chiron emerged from the shadows. His gaze immediately fell on Ethan at the seal, and the familiar, but now much more acute, tension tensed between them again. "You're not who you say you are," he says quietly, and it sounds less like an accusation than a demand to finally break the lie. Ethan doesn't turn around immediately, his hand still on the seal, as if deciding whether to finish what he started or, for the first time, reveal more than he planned. Only then does he slowly turn his head, take a step back from the door and lower his hand, acknowledging the presence of a witness who can no longer be deceived by his previous awkwardness. Chiron comes closer, almost right up to the border of the seals, and his breathing is noticeably ragged. He is standing before something he can neither explain nor deny, and it weighs on him more than a direct threat. "Show me," he says curtly, but there's more tension in that one word than any threat. Ethan looks at him longer than he should, as if he's truly weighing the price of truth. Instead of answering, he activates a weak spell near the wall and waits for it to fully open, then with a sharp, almost dry movement he changes the pressure. The line of light breaks and crumbles without a splash right before Karen's eyes, too cleanly to be attributed to a trick. Chiron sucks in a breath and takes an involuntary step back, because he sees not more powerful magic, but magic for which he simply has no language. The hardness in his gaze gives way for the first time to pure shock. "It's impossible," he breathes out, almost in a whisper, but the words sound not like a conclusion, but like an attempt to hold on to the familiar world that is already cracking in his hands. Ethan lowers his hand and looks straight ahead for the first time, without hiding. "That's just not how they taught me," and this phrase forms a thin crack between them, which immediately begins to spread beyond the meaning of the words. Karen clenches his jaw, turns away for a second, as if trying to regain his footing, but when he looks at Ethan again, there is no longer anger in his eyes, but a fierce determination to move on, even if everything familiar collapses ahead. "If this is true, then everything we stand on," he says slowly and cuts himself off, because he is not yet ready to name out loud the abyss whose edge he has already seen. Ethan steps aside, clearing the way to the archives, and although his shoulders remain relaxed, his gaze does not leave Karen, as if the decision now is more important than any explanation. Chiron passes by, stops at the door, and raises his hand to the seals, but does not touch them. Now he feels in them the same form that he had just seen torn apart, and the simple recognition sends a chill down his spine. He slowly lowers his hand, turns to Ethan, and there is no longer the same confidence in his gaze, only a heavy question that makes it impossible to turn back. "The exam," he says finally, clinging to the last stable point of peace, and Ethan nods briefly, accepting this word as a temporary boundary beyond which they both already know there will be no turning back. The morning of the exam arrives with a cold light, and the arena fills with spectators, the air vibrating with anticipation, because everyone remembers the incident of the previous day, even if they don't speak of it out loud. Ethan steps onto the platform slowly, deliberately, his steps hollow on the stone, and Karen is already standing in the center, collected as always, but there is a new depth in his gaze that was not there before. The judge raises his hand, giving the signal, and the space around them begins to fill with protective seals, creating a closed arena where everything will be measured, recorded, and judged. Chiron takes the first step, his movement is perfect as ever, and he unleashes a chain of spells without pause, creating pressure that usually breaks an opponent in seconds. Ethan raises his hand hesitantly, as if he's late again, and the first blow passes close, grazing his shoulder, but at the moment of contact he changes the angle of his palm, and the stream trembles, losing some of its shape. He steps back, letting the attack look successful, and falls to his knee as if he had failed to hold his defense, and Karen is already preparing the next blow, increasing the pressure, giving no respite. The second attack comes faster, harder, and Ethan doesn't have time to completely break the structure. The energy scratches the skin, leaving a thin line, and he clenches his teeth, maintaining control, not allowing himself to break away. He rises, takes a short step forward, and this time does not retreat completely, but at the moment the spell opens, he abruptly changes the pressure, and the flow bends, going to the side, not reaching the target. Karen notices this, his eyes narrowing, and he changes tactics, adding unstable elements to the spell, trying to push beyond the boundaries where Ethan senses structure and the air in the arena begins to tremble. Ethan takes a breath, short and sharp, and his fingers move faster, tearing at the knots mid-flight, but each time with more effort as the structure becomes more complex, the control requiring more precision. Blows collide, energy radiates outwards, scraping the arena's protective seals, and the spectators retreat, feeling the pressure go beyond their usual limits, while the referee tensely watches every movement. At some point, Ethan finds himself closer than he planned, and their distance is reduced to a step, and he raises his hand, feeling the key knot in Siren's spell where everything is held together. His fingers hover in midair for a split second, and in that frozen gesture the entire structure of the other man's spell feels like a taut thread, ready to snap if a precise, almost gentle pressure is applied. Karen sees this moment all too clearly, and his gaze widens as he feels control slipping away not through force, but through the form itself, and this sensation doesn't fit into any of the patterns he's learned. Ethan makes a movement, short and precise, as if breaking an invisible joint, and Karen's spell loses its hold, bending inward as if space itself refused to support it. The flow breaks, goes to the side, and for a second there is emptiness between them, strange and quiet, where there is no attack, no defense, only the absence of what should have been. Karen takes a step back, instinctively, his breath catching as he finds himself in a space for the first time where his usual reactions don't work, and his body can't find support in familiar patterns. Ethan doesn't pursue, he stays where he is, his hands still raised, and there is no triumph in his posture, only a tense holding of a line he could cross but hasn't yet. The referee steps forward as if to intervene, but stops because he cannot classify what is happening, and his hand remains in the air, not finding a command. Chiron straightens up, clenching his fingers, and there is a hardness in his eyes, like an attempt to regain control through effort, and he launches a new series of spells, sharper, almost aggressive. The air around them rips with pressure, and Ethan steps to the side, allowing the first wave to pass by, but at the moment of opening, he changes the angle of his palm again, and part of the flow goes to the side, losing its shape. The second wave hits faster, and he doesn't have time to completely break the structure. The energy hits his ribs, forcing him to exhale sharply, and he loses his balance for a second, feeling real pain. He drops to one knee, his palm touches the stone, and the cold surface brings back his concentration, and his father's voice floats in his head, quiet and even, as always, "Don't rush, listen to the form." Ethan looks up, his vision sharpening, and he stands up slowly, making no sudden movements, as if he's readjusting his rhythm to the chaos that Karen is creating. Karen notices this change, and his attacks become even faster, almost jerky, as if he were trying to break the very possibility of analysis, preventing Ethan from catching onto the structure. Ethan steps forward instead of retreating, and this move disrupts the expected pattern of the fight because he enters an area where the spells have not yet stabilized, and their form is vulnerable there. His fingers move sharply, almost roughly, and one of the streams collapses inward, disappearing without a splash, while the second goes sideways, crashing into the protective barrier, which trembles under the impact. The spectators retreat even further as the space around the arena begins to behave strangely, and the lines of defense flicker as if their structure too is coming under pressure from an alien principle. Karen pauses for a split second, and in that brief gap, something shifts inside him as he realizes that this is not a random occurrence, but a pattern he has not studied. "Why don't you use force?" he says sharply, almost defiantly, his voice louder than necessary, as if he's trying to bring the fight back into the familiar realm of words. Ethan doesn't answer right away. He makes another movement, breaking another knot, and only then says quietly, "Because she already is," and the words sound almost mundane, but they cut through the space. Karen clenches his jaw, and his next attack is not textbook, but with a clear overload, as if he decided to break the system through excess pressure, without thinking about the consequences. The flow becomes unstable, pulsating, and Ethan freezes for a second because the structure loses its predictability, and any interference could cause an explosion that would affect them both. He steps back, raising both hands, his fingers trembling with the precision required, and he waits for the chaos within the flow to organize itself into a readable form for a second. In that brief moment he makes a movement, fast and hard, and the flow collapses, losing pressure, disappearing into the void, leaving behind only a faint shimmer, like a trace of a light that has gone out. Karen freezes, looking at the spot where the attack just happened, and his shoulders slowly sag as he feels his usual support disappear, leaving him in a space without rules. The judge finally steps forward, opening his mouth to announce the result, but stops because he doesn't know what to say and the words get stuck, unable to find form. Ethan stands up straight, his breathing still uneven, and he looks at Karen without challenge, simply holding his gaze, as if he's waiting not for victory but for a decision Karen must make for himself. Chiron looks up, and there is no longer the same confidence in them, only a heavy, almost painful understanding that the measurement of power here no longer works as it once did. Ethan slowly lowers his hand, and there is no weariness in the gesture, only a conscious refusal to take the next step, which could finally change the outcome, but would destroy something greater. "Enough," he says quietly, and the word sounds not like a request, but like a boundary that he draws himself, without relying on the judge, the rules, or the expectations of the audience. A wave of whispers passes through the room, and the judge finally finds his voice, but before he can say anything, Karen raises his hand, stopping him with a gesture previously only used by the teacher. He looks at Ethan for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his, and then nods slowly, acknowledging not defeat but something else, something that doesn't fit into conventional categories but demands acceptance. "It's a draw," he says himself, and the word falls into space, breaking expectations, because it is not fixed by rules, but chosen by him personally, contrary to the system he trusted. The judge freezes, unable to confirm or deny what he has heard, and turns his gaze to Valeria. Her face remains motionless, but in her eyes appears the shadow of a person who sees the inevitable finally come to light. The noise in the hall is already loud, almost rude, because the word draw here sounds like a breakdown of the mechanism on which all order was maintained, and this confusion affects everyone, from students to teachers. Karen turns to the balcony and demands, no longer as a student, but as a participant in what is happening, answer, and now this question no longer belongs to Ethan alone. Valeria doesn't answer right away. She looks down at the arena, at the two students who have escaped her control, and her fingers dig into the railing again, leaving white marks, betraying the tension she can no longer hide completely. She takes a step forward, the light falls on her face more sharply, emphasizing the rigidity of the lines, and in this one movement one can already read a decision that has been brewing for a long time and is now inevitably coming to light. "The Academy protects peace," she says clearly, and the official weight of the phrase sounds so familiar that it cuts even harder. Everyone in the room has heard these words dozens of times, but never at a moment like this. Ethan tilts his head slightly, and a thin, almost tired shadow of a smile flickers in his gaze, the smile of a man who knows all too well the value of beautiful formulations. Chiron takes another step forward, going beyond all permitted boundaries, and asks harshly, at whose expense, cutting through the smooth surface of the director's speech with one blow more accurately than any magic. A new silence descends on the room, not respectful, but strained to the limit, and for the first time, many look at Valeria not as an authority figure, but as a person obliged to name the price of the system. Valeria exhales slowly, almost imperceptibly, but in this movement one can hear the weariness of someone who has held the same words like a shield for too long, and now the shield is beginning to press from within. Her gaze slides over Ethan, lingering for a moment, and in that brief contact something personal, almost painful, slips through before the familiar mask has time to close again. There is knowledge that is dangerous without control, she says slowly, evenly, but the former firmness in the formula is no longer there. A crack can be heard in it, too subtle for the crowd, but obvious to those standing in the center of the arena. Ethan takes a step closer to the center and calmly answers, "That's why they erased them, without pressure, without shouting, like a man who was finally saying out loud a long-known fact." Chiron turns sharply to Valeria, and his eyes show not just doubt, but pain, because what he heard coincides with what he didn't want to even think about. Valeria is silent, and this silence sounds more convincing than any defense. The audience seems to freeze on the breath, realizing that the next step cannot be reversed. He takes a step back, breaking the line with Chiron, and turns towards the arena exit, not waiting for the judge's decision or the system's permission, as if with this very movement he acknowledges, the conversation is over, the action is beginning. Chiron remains where he is, watching Ethan until he disappears beyond the arena's edge, then slowly looks back at Valeria, his gaze now devoid of the same unconditional faith. Ethan walks out of the arena without quickening his pace, even as the noise behind him grows louder. The fingers of his right hand tremble slightly, holding on to the residual tension from the torn structures and the boundary he'd just crossed. The corridor greets him with emptiness and cold light, where every step sounds too distinctly, as if the academy itself is listening to him, and the walls hold the remnants of old spells that he feels on his skin, like scars under stone. He doesn't turn towards the dorms, he goes straight to the archives, and in this choice there is no longer any mask or doubt. The whole path, all the mistakes, all the humiliations from the very beginning led precisely here. He pauses before the door for only a moment, the seals slowly open, recognizing the presence of a stranger. The air grows heavy, as before a thunderstorm, and Ethan raises his hand calmly, as if he had come not to break the ban, but to reclaim what was his. His fingers touch the first line of defense, but he doesn't press immediately. He traces the structure like a seam in fabric, searching for a point with a skewed distribution of force, and only when he finds it does he transfer precise, economical force there. The seal shudders, loses its shape, and fades without a sound. Ethan takes a step forward and can already feel the next defense hastily reforming, trying to close the breach before he can penetrate deeper. He repeats the movement faster and harder. The second structure crumbles into shimmering remnants, but somewhere in the depths of the archive, a response network is already awakening, and time suddenly becomes as much an enemy as any guard. It's dark inside, the cold of old paper mixed with stone and dust, and the shelves go deep in long rows, as if the archive itself were designed like a labyrinth, where knowledge is hidden not only by locks, but also by distance. Ethan walks slowly between the shelves, running his fingers over the spines, until he stops at the unmarked section. At first glance, it's empty, but the air here is thicker, quieter, like a place hidden not from prying eyes, but from memory itself. He raises his hand and touches the void with a short movement, and the hidden seal appears in a pale light, as if the space reluctantly acknowledges his right to see what is supposedly not there. Without giving the wards time to stabilize, Ethan abruptly changes the pressure, breaking the node before it can close, and a narrow passage opens in the wall to a hidden compartment where the scrolls lie, covered not just in dust, but in deliberate oblivion. He picks up one scroll, his fingers lingering on the rough surface longer than necessary. When the parchment unfurls, familiar handwriting appears before him as suddenly as if a voice he hasn't heard in years had spoken from the darkness. At that moment, footsteps are heard from the corridor, even, unhurried, too calm for a casual witness, and the light falls into the archive, capturing the figure of Valeria, who has stopped precisely at the edge of the shadow, as if she knew exactly where she would find him. "I knew you'd come here," she says quietly, and there's no surprise or reproach in her voice, only a tired confirmation of a long-calculated outcome. Ethan doesn't turn around right away. First he carefully rolls up the scroll and only then slowly turns his head, meeting her gaze in the narrow, dimly lit passage between the shelves, where it's too late for either of them to retreat. "You knew him," he says calmly, without a questioning intonation, and the confirmation is already visible on her face before she has time to answer. Valeria takes a step forward, the light touches her eyes, and something alive, almost painful, flashes in them for a moment before giving way to the usual restraint again. "He was a genius," she replies shortly, and the admission sounds too heavy for simple praise, as if behind it there is a long list of things that had to be hidden. Ethan takes a step towards her, closing the distance. Then why was it erased? And after these words, the silence between them becomes so dense that it seems part of the archive's protection. Valeria looks down at the scroll in his hand, and her fingers clench slightly, as if she is holding inside not an answer, but a flash of the past that cannot be released even now. Because he left me no choice, she says slowly, and in her voice there is the tension of someone who has repeated this excuse to herself many times to keep it from crumbling. Ethan tilts his head slightly, and his gaze hardens, or because he took it away, and the phrase penetrates the silence so precisely that for a second even her breath is knocked out of her. Valeria looks up sharply, irritation flares in them, but it quickly fades, giving way to a weariness that can no longer be completely hidden behind the role of director. You think you understand, she says, moving even closer until there are only a few steps between them, but you only see part of it. Ethan doesn't move and quietly answers, you too, without raising his voice, without pressing intonation, and that's precisely why the words hit harder than a direct challenge. Footsteps sounded in the hallway again, quick and determined this time, and a second later, Chiron appeared in the doorway. He stopped at the threshold, his gaze immediately finding them both, as if he had come specifically here, with no room for error. He enters without hiding, and the air between the shelves becomes even heavier, because the tension is now divided between three, and each stands on his own line, which he is not yet ready to cross first. I won't leave without an answer, Chiron says harshly, but his voice carries the brokenness of a man whose old support has already collapsed and a new one has not yet been built. Valeria turns her gaze to him, and for a second her face gathers itself into the director's tough mask, but it immediately cracks, giving way to something more personal and more tired. She inhales slowly, and in that inhalation there is a final decision. There can be no more delay. When she begins to speak, her voice no longer sounds like an order, but like a confession for which there will be a price. The academy is built on his works, she says clearly, and the words fall into the archive like a blow to a supporting structure, as if the walls themselves should remember what was hidden within them. Chiron freezes, his gaze going blank for a second because what he's heard doesn't fit into any of the foundations he's been holding onto, and his breathing becomes uneven, almost painful. Ethan doesn't move, only clutches the scroll tighter, and the tense line of his fingers shows that what he's holding isn't just paper, but the last material remnant of the man who was taken from him. And you killed him, he says quietly, connecting the dots without pause or retreat, so that after this phrase neither side can hide behind half-truths. Valeria closes her eyes for a brief moment, and in this gesture there is more of an answer than in any confession, but when she opens them again, she returns to her gaze the firmness of a person who still intends to hold to her version to the end. We stopped what was getting out of control, she replies, and the hardness returns to her voice, like armor that is put on not because it is comfortable, but because you cannot stand without it. Chiron takes a step back, hitting his back against the bookcase, and his fingers clench into fists. Two versions of the world are now playing in the same room, and they can no longer coexist without destroying one of them. We stopped what was getting out of control, she replies, her voice hardening again, as if she were returning to a role that allows her to hold her own. Chiron takes a step back, his back against the shelving, his fingers curling into fists as he hears two versions that can no longer coexist without cracks. Ethan slowly raises his hand, and the air around him changes slightly, as if before a movement, and his gaze does not leave Valeria, as if he is waiting for the last answer, which will never come. Valeria makes a barely perceptible gesture, and the seals around the archive begin to activate, glowing with a cold light, and the space begins to close, as if it were taking sides itself. Chiron's head snaps up, his gaze shifting from her to Ethan, and in that movement there's a decision he makes without words, based only on what he's seen. Stop, he says loudly, the sound of his voice cutting through the tension, but the seals don't stop, continuing to close as if they can no longer be undone. Ethan steps forward without retreating, and his fingers move, tearing apart one of the structures, and the light goes out in the area, revealing a narrow passage that should not have appeared. Valeria looks at this movement, and the same expression that was in the hall appears in her eyes, not fear, but recognition that in front of her stands what she tried to erase. Chiron takes a step towards Ethan, standing next to him until their shoulders are aligned, and there's more meaning in that simple gesture than any words he could say. The seals continue to close, but not as smoothly, and the lines of defense tremble, as if the system itself could not hold its shape under pressure it was unfamiliar with. Ethan looks at Valeria, and his voice sounds quiet but clear. There is still a choice, and the words remain hanging in the air, not finding an immediate answer. Valeria doesn't answer, she stands motionless, and only her fingers slowly unclench, as if she were letting go of something she had been holding for too long, and this movement remains unfinished. Karen looks from her to Ethan, his breathing evening out as if he's made a decision that no longer requires confirmation, even if the cost is unknown. The light of the seals flares brighter, then at several points at once falls into darkness, and in this cracked second the space freezes, holding the choice that has not yet been made, but can no longer be undone.